Far above the valley floor, where the clouds move at eye level and the air carries a coldness that settles into the bones, there is a city. It sits on a mountain ridge so narrow that the ground drops away sharply on either side, falling hundreds of meters into the canyon below. The walls are cut from granite blocks so large that a single one could fill a room, and they fit against each other so completely that after 500 years of Andean weather, not one has shifted. You could press a sheet of paper against any joint in any wall and it would not slide through. The gap simply is not there. The people who built this place had no iron tools, no cranes, no pulleys, no wheeled carts of any kind. What they had were stones, wooden implements, plant fiber ropes, and a body of knowledge passed entirely by hand and memory across generations. With those things, they raised a city at 2,400 meters above sea level, a city with functioning water supply, sophisticated drainage, astronomical temples, and agricultural terraces that could feed its entire population without a single delivery from the valley below. This is Machu Picchu, the lost city of the Incas, and it continues to hand researchers more questions than answers. How did people working without iron manage to lift multi-ton stones up a near-vertical mountain and set them to tolerances that embarrass modern construction? How have these structures survived 5 centuries of earthquakes and tropical storms, while newer buildings in the valley have crumbled and been rebuilt many times over? What exactly were these temples for, and what knowledge did the builders carry that allowed them to align a stone window to the precise angle of a winter solstice sunrise? Today we're going to go looking for those answers and see how far they take us. The story begins roughly 550 years ago, when the Inca ruler Pachacutec decided he wanted a retreat. He was the most powerful figure in the Western Hemisphere, commanding an empire that ran from the equator to the southern tip of the continent, across jungles, coastal deserts, and high mountain passes. He had no shortage of places to build, and yet the location he chose was one that made no obvious practical sense. A razor-thin ridge suspended between 2 peaks, with deep gorges on every side, and a roaring river far beneath. Isolated by geography, invisible from below, accessible only by steep, narrow trails. The Inca kept no written records. They had no books, no blueprints, no engineering manuals of any kind. The knowledge that made Machu Picchu possible lived in the minds and hands of the people who built it, the master stonemasons, the hydraulic engineers, the astronomers who calculated where the sun would fall on a specific morning centuries into the future. When that population was gone, their knowledge went with them. What we know today about how this city was made comes from reading what it left behind: the tool marks on the stone, the physical behavior of the structures, the logic embedded in every design decision. It is painstaking inference, and it is still incomplete. The most extraordinary thing about Machu Picchu is something no visitor can see. Before a single wall rose above the surface, the builders put nearly 2/3 of their total effort underground. Beneath every plaza, every temple, every house and pathway on the ridge, they constructed an invisible foundation, successive layers of large stone, then gravel, then sand, that acts as a filtration system for the enormous volumes of water the mountain receives during the rainy season. Without it, the soil beneath the structures would saturate, the weight of the buildings would push down on unstable ground, and the entire city would eventually slide. Because of it, Machu Picchu has stood through thousands of storms and has not moved. The system was not added later as a repair. It was the first thing built before anything else, evidence that the builders understood the mountain's behavior intimately before they began and designed against it from the ground up. The main building material was grey granite, quarried directly from the ridge. This was itself a decision of quiet brilliance. Bringing stone up from the valley would have been an almost impossible undertaking, so the builders sourced it at altitude, where it already was. To break rock from the mountain face, they drove dry wooden wedges into natural cracks in the stone, then soaked the wedges with water. As the wood expanded, it split the granite along its own grain, a slow process, but one that required nothing more than water and patience. What happened to the stone after it was separated from the mountain is where the account becomes less certain. The Inca did not simply stack blocks. They shaped each one individually, grinding and refining every face until it sat in perfect contact with the faces of the stones around it. Each block in the finest structures has between 6 and 12 individual surfaces, and every surface had to be worked until it fit, not approximately, but exactly. A stone would be placed against its neighbor, the gaps observed, the stone removed, material chipped away, and the process repeated. Dozens of cycles for a single joint. Hundreds of joints in a single wall. If you tried to slide a knife blade between 2 blocks in any of the ceremonial buildings at Machu Picchu, you would not succeed. 500 years after they were set, the fit is still that precise. What kind of knowledge does it take to produce that? And how do you pass it on without writing a single word of it down? No mortar was used, no cement, no clay, no binding agent of any kind. The blocks hold together through the perfection of their contact and their own considerable weight. But this was not simply a stylistic choice or a limitation of available materials. It was a structural decision made in direct response to the environment. The Andes are seismically active. A mortar wall, when the ground moves, cracks along its joints and collapses. A dry stone wall of this kind behaves differently. During a tremor, the blocks shift fractionally against each other, absorbing the energy through thousands of contact points. When the shaking stops, they settle back into position under gravity. The wall does not crack. It dances, and then it rests. This is why the citadel above the valley has survived earthquakes that destroyed more recent constructions below. It was built to move with the mountain rather than resist it. That understanding of how stone behaves under seismic stress, how to design a joint that absorbs rather than fractures, was encoded into the masonry itself, carried in the hands of builders who had no formal vocabulary for what they knew. Across the site, the quality of the stonework shifts according to purpose. Residential buildings and storage areas were raised with smaller stones and lower tolerances. As you move toward the sacred heart of the city, the temples, the ceremonial plazas, the astronomical markers, the stone grows larger, the joints tighter, the surfaces smoother. The inward tilt of the walls in the most important structures, their corners leaning fractionally toward the interior, is not a mistake. It is another layer of stability engineering, reducing the leverage that lateral force can exert on the building. Every choice carries intention. Moving the largest blocks, some weighing more than 20 tons, remains one of the most debated aspects of the site. The Inca understood the principle of the wheel, but the terrain made it useless. A wheeled cart on a staircase path is not a solution. Instead, teams of workers numbered in the hundreds hauled stones up, inclined earthen ramps using thick ropes woven from plant fibers. Rounded timber logs and smooth river stones placed beneath the blocks reduced friction. Strange protrusions visible on some of the blocks, which were later chipped off once the stone was seated, served as attachment and leverage points during transport, allowing workers to guide each massive piece precisely into its designated position. After placement, the surface was made smooth. The evidence of the effort was removed. Only the result remained. Every path and every window in the city tracks the movement of the sun. The relationship between the built environment and the sky was not decorative, it was fundamental. For more than 400 years, Machu Picchu was invisible to the wider world. This is a remarkable fact when you consider that it sits just 100 kilometers from Cusco, the former capital of the Inca Empire, a city the Spanish knew well and occupied entirely. The conquistadors who swept through the Andes in the 16th century dismantled temples, melted gold, and recorded everything they found. They heard rumors of cities hidden in the highlands. They never found this one. The steep approach, the density of the cloud forest, and the deliberate destruction of the main access trail before the city was vacated kept it out of reach. No soldier in heavy armor could navigate the near-vertical cliffs and dense vegetation that surrounded the ridge. The mountain itself was the defense. Over the generations that followed, even local knowledge of the site faded. The families who farmed the lower slopes were aware of stone structures somewhere above them, but the full understanding of what the place was, what it had been, drifted gradually into the territory of half-remembered things, treated less as history than as the kind of story that surrounds old stones everywhere in the highlands. Everything changed in July 1911. An American academic from Yale University named Hiram Bingham arrived in Peru with a specific target, Vilcabamba, the last stronghold of the Inca resistance, where the final rulers had held out against the Spanish for decades before the conquest was finally sealed. Bingham was a historian, not a trained field archaeologist, but he moved with energy and institutional support, and he was willing to follow leads that more cautious researchers might have set aside. Farmers in the valley told him about ruins on the ridge above. They mentioned it without particular weight. It was simply something that was there, as it had always been. Bingham hired a local sergeant and agreed to follow a 10-year-old shepherd boy named Pablito, whose family had been tending crops on the ancient terraces for years, planting vegetables among the stone structures without fully registering what surrounded them. On the morning of July 24th, in cold rain, the three of them began to climb. The ascent was brutal. They pulled themselves up near vertical sections of cliff face, gripping tree roots, their boots sliding on wet rock. When they finally reached the ridge and the cloud thinned enough to see, Bingham stopped. From the jungle on all sides, granite walls emerged, enormous, intact, precise. Trees had rooted through doorways, vines curtained the lintels. But the stone beneath was unmarked and exact, as though the buildings had been set aside last season rather than abandoned 4 centuries earlier. Bingham wrote that night that he could not trust his own eyes. In a place that no map acknowledged, on the edge of a drop into nothing, stood the finest stonework he had ever encountered. He spent hours moving through the site, clearing the surfaces with his hands, trying to understand what he was looking at. The absence of anything European was the first thing that struck him. No cross, no modification to suit a colonial function, no sign that the Spanish had ever stood here. It was a sealed world, a complete and untouched record of a civilization that had been overwritten almost everywhere else. Bingham's first conclusion was wrong. He was certain he had found Vilcabamba. He published that conviction, and it shaped early understanding of the site for years. It took subsequent decades of research to establish that the real Vilcabamba was a different site entirely, deeper in the jungle, far less architecturally significant. Machu Picchu was something else, something whose full purpose the conquest had made it impossible to record in the voices of the people who knew it. The excavations that followed produced hundreds of skeletal remains, the majority of them female. This finding gave rise to an early theory, widely circulated and long-lasting, that the city had been home to the Virgins of the Sun, chosen women dedicated to the Inca solar cult. Photographs published in National Geographic in 1913 made Machu Picchu an instant global sensation. A city that defied the logic of its time, built by a people who had neither iron nor draft animals, had been sitting undiscovered 100 kilometers from a colonial capital for 4 centuries. The world wanted an explanation. The explanation that arrived first was not the right one. When the first story told about a place turns out to be incorrect, and that story has already reached millions of people, how long does the correction actually take to travel? The artifact dispute added another layer of difficulty. Bingham removed thousands of objects from the site, ceramics, metal ornaments, human remains, textiles, under an agreement with the Peruvian government that promised their return within 18 months. They were not returned for nearly a century. The negotiation between Yale and Peru over those objects became one of the most drawn-out repatriation disputes in the history of archaeology, resolved only in 2012. For 100 years, the primary physical evidence for understanding who had lived at Machu Picchu and how they had used it sat in a university archive in Connecticut. Standing on the main plaza and looking at the walls surrounding you, the mind resists what the eyes are telling it. The Incas had no steel, no cables, no iron bars of any kind. Their toolkit was stone, bronze, and wood. And with those things, they shaped granite, one of the hardest materials on Earth, to tolerances that a modern stonemason working with power tools would be proud of. The quarry sat directly on the ridge, which was the most important logistical decision the builders made. Hauling stone up from the valley would have demanded a scale of effort that would have made the project impossible to complete in any reasonable time frame. By working with the stone already present at altitude, they eliminated the most physically impossible part of the transport problem. Everything that needed to be moved was moved along the ridge itself, still a tremendous undertaking, but one that fell within the bounds of what organized human effort, applied with intelligence and patience, can accomplish. Seen from above, the agricultural terraces that wrap around the mountain's flanks look like a landscape feature, a visual characteristic of the site. They are in fact a precision food production and hydrological management system operating simultaneously. On slopes, this steep, unmodified ground loses its topsoil in the first heavy rain. The terraces prevented that by creating level planting surfaces and controlling the movement of water through a carefully layered internal structure. Coarse stone at the base for drainage, then gravel, then sand, then fertile topsoil carried up from the valley in bundles on workers' backs. The stones within the terrace walls absorbed heat during the day and released it through the night, raising the temperature around the root zone by several degrees, enough to grow maize and other warm weather crops at an altitude where they would otherwise fail. Researchers estimate the terrace area was sufficient to feed the full resident population of 700 to 1,000 people with no outside supply. Water was the harder problem. No spring exists at the level of the ridge. Inca engineers located a source on the adjacent mountain slope and built a stone channel 750 meters long, graded with enough slope to sustain flow but not so much that it would erode the channel bed. That gradient, calibrated to within a few percentage points of engineering optimum, achieved without instruments, has functioned for over 500 years. The water entered the city through a first basin reserved for the emperor, then flowed through 16 further distribution points spread across the site. Drinking water and stormwater drainage were kept entirely separate. Under every major surface, the same layered filtration system as the hidden foundation allowed even the heaviest tropical rain to move through and away without pooling or causing ground saturation. Modern engineers who have studied the system say that reproducing it today without pumps and modern piping would be extremely difficult. A water channel calibrated to within a few percentage points of engineering optimum, functioning without a single repair for 5 centuries, built by people who left no written record of how they calculated it. That is not a mystery that shrinks the more you look at it. The Incas did not try to impose the city on the mountain. They read the mountain and responded to it. When construction reached a large granite outcrop, the stone was not blasted away or worked around. It was incorporated, turned into the base of a building, the foundation of a wall, or a sacred altar. This approach distributed the structural load across the underlying geology rather than concentrating it, giving the site its extraordinary resistance to ground movement and landslide. The Intihuatana stone, the carved ritual marker at the highest point of the city, is not a placed object. It is cut directly from the living bedrock of the summit. The city and the mountain share the same material. They are in a precise physical sense one thing. Every element of the site, from the smallest drainage groove to the massive retaining walls along the lower terraces, reflects a standard of attention that we are, in some areas, only beginning to be able to measure and describe. The builders created something that could exist in complete self-sufficiency, isolated from the rest of the world by the mountain itself, sustained by the mountain's stone, water, and soil. Life inside Machu Picchu was governed by order and ritual. The city divided cleanly into 2 zones, a residential sector for the people who maintained it, and a sacred district whose structures were built to a different standard and oriented to different purposes. Most scholars today place the site's primary function as a royal estate, a retreat for the Emperor Pachacutec, where he could receive important guests, conduct ceremonies, and withdraw from the demands of the capital. At its height, between 500 and 1,000 people occupied the site at any time: servants, craftspeople, priests, and the attendants who kept the sacred spaces clean and properly observed. The Temple of the Sun is the only curved building in the city. Its walls embrace a natural granite outcrop that serves as an altar, and a precisely angled window faces northeast. On the morning of the winter solstice, the first light of dawn enters through that window and falls directly on the center of the altar stone. The margin of error in the original construction, the tolerance between the alignment achieved and the astronomical alignment intended, is less than the width of a human hand across the full span of the wall. The Inca did not simply observe the sky, they built it into the geometry of the stone. Below the temple, a chamber cut into the natural rock, called the Royal Tomb, is lined with the finest stonework on the site. Researchers believe it may have held the mummified remains of noble ancestors who, in Inca belief, did not simply cease to exist at death. They continued as participants in the life of the community, consulted at ceremonies, maintained in the city as active presences. The dead inhabited Machu Picchu alongside the living. The Temple of the Three Windows faces east, each opening oriented to receive the first light of dawn. The masonry here reaches a level of finish where the joins appear as fine lines in an otherwise continuous surface, and the stone has been worked smooth enough that it feels different from ordinary cut granite. The sacred plaza beside it was the space for the most important state gatherings, and its acoustic properties appear to have been considered in its design. A voice projected from the center carries to the far edges of the space without effort, giving the figure who stood there a quality of presence that the surrounding walls amplified into something close to the divine. At the highest point of the city stands the Intihuatana, the place where the sun is tied. Priests performed rituals here at the solstices, believing they were preventing the sun from drifting permanently to the horizon, ensuring its return for another year. The stone is oriented to the cardinal directions with a precision that continues to impress surveyors using modern equipment. The Spanish who moved through the Andes systematically destroyed these ritual markers wherever they found them. They never reached Machu Picchu. This one survived. Daily life in the residential quarter was simple and functional. No furniture. People slept on woven mats or animal skins and kept their belongings in niches carved into the walls. Each residential cluster had ventilation and water access. Each district maintained workshops for textile production from alpaca wool and for ceramic work. The city sustained itself in all the ways that mattered: food, water, shelter, purpose, without requiring anything from the world below. Machu Picchu was inhabited for just over 100 years. Around 1572, the population left. Not in flight from an enemy, no battle occurred here, no fire, no sign of violence on any street or in any building. The residents departed in order, taking with them whatever could be carried. What they left was the city itself, whole, intact, and sealed. Before they went, they destroyed the main road. Not damaged, deliberately obliterated, so that the approach to the ridge would become invisible from below. Whatever was being protected here would stay protected. The mountain and the forest would do the rest. The reasons for the departure remain a matter of debate, and they were probably multiple. The Spanish conquest had introduced diseases to the continent that moved far ahead of the soldiers themselves. Smallpox reached Andean populations years before direct contact, and the resulting mortality was catastrophic. A site as complex as Machu Picchu required skilled specialists, engineers, priests, master masons, whose roles were trained across generations. When those people were gone, the knowledge needed to maintain the city went with them. Simultaneously, a civil war between rival Inca claimants to the throne had already fractured central authority before the Spanish arrived. When Cusco fell, the administrative network that connected the empire's satellite sites to its core collapsed. The city could sustain itself physically, but it could not sustain itself in isolation from the civilization that had given it meaning. The residents moved deeper into the jungle, intending to wait out the disruption and return. They never did. A handful of local families retained knowledge of the site across the following generations, farming the terraces, knowing the walls were there. But the full understanding of what Machu Picchu was, what it had been built for, how it had worked, moved slowly out of active knowledge. By 1911, it had become, for most of the world, a rumor at the edge of a myth. Today, Machu Picchu is recognized as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. Visitor numbers have had to be restricted to protect the site from the physical effects of modern feet on ancient stone. a measure that acknowledges quietly that we remain capable of damaging in a decade what the mountain preserved intact for 5 centuries. The tension between access and preservation is ongoing, and it adds one more layer of complication to a place that has never been simple. Modern instruments have identified sealed areas beneath the current excavation surface, chambers and passages that have not been opened, whose contents remain unknown. The archaeology of Machu Picchu is not finished. Each season of careful work adds something to the picture, and each addition tends to expand the territory of what remains to be understood rather than closing it. We still do not know, with any demonstrated certainty, how the Incas produced stone joints to the tolerances visible in the finest structures, using the tools we believe they had in granite. We do not know how the solstice alignment of the Temple of the Sun was calculated and verified before construction began. We do not know what is in the sealed chambers. We do not know how long the tradition of knowledge that produced this site took to develop, or where it began. A civilization that built a city to last forever, then left it in perfect order, sealed the road behind them and walked away, is making a statement of some kind. We are still working out what it is. The ancient builders left behind something that has outlasted every force that has been applied to it. Conquest, abandonment, jungle, time. Looking at the perfect seams where 2 granite faces meet after 5 centuries, or watching the winter solstice light move across the altar exactly as it was designed to move, you are in contact with a quality of knowledge and attention that our explanations have not yet fully contained. Not because those explanations are wrong, because they are not yet complete. The greatness of what was built here was not measured in wealth or territory. It was measured in the precision with which people who had only stone and sky and an understanding of both were able to create something that the mountain has held in place, unchanged ever since. The city stands, the water still runs, the solstice still finds the window, and the questions the stones raise, quiet, specific, patient, are still waiting for answers as careful as they are.